So this was an earthquake that's kind of notorious, happened in this part of the Italian Apennine. So Rome would be just off to the lower left, and the Adriatic is up there on the right. And so the color coding is kind of the mountains. And we can see that there's been a bunch of earthquakes in this area, even historically. So you can see in the upper left, in the sort of lime colors, magnitude 6.1 Marche, Umbria, Colfiorito earthquake in 1997. This affected the St. Francis of Assisi church. There was also then in 2009, the earthquake I'm going to talk about now, L'Aquila earthquake. But then between them, actually in 2016, were 3 earthquakes that were really devastating, this Amatrice sequence. And so we can see it's kind of oversimplified, but sort of filling these gaps along the Apennine. And so, like our Italian colleagues, when they felt the earthquakes in Rome, and they were like, excuse my language, they were like, shit, we know it. They knew exactly where it was, because they were like, it has to be in this zone, and it wasn't in L'Aquila, and it wasn't in Colfiorito. It must have been between. So this earthquake it was in some senses a typical Apennine earthquake, so it wasn't a surprise to the seismologists. But what was notorious about was how the interaction with the public and decision making occurred. And so one of the big things then was that the scientists were charged with manslaughter at lower courts in Italy because of allegations of mishandling the information. So we're going to talk about that. But first, let's look at the earthquake. So this is the time-independent earthquake forecast. So you just asked about forecasting based on instrumental historic seismicity and paleoseismology. So this was expected. Like, this is right in the purplest part of Italy. So there's no doubt this was going to happen. It's just that if you look at the fine print down there, it says probabilistic seismic hazard map for Italy, ground acceleration with 10% probability of exceedance in the next 50 years. So we expected high ground motions in this area, but we just couldn't say it was going to happen in 2009. So here's what was happening then in that period. So this is the month is the second number. So this is March 17th through April 6th. Then this is magnitude. So one of the things about this part of the world, Apennines, is that it's kind of swarmy, which means that we get lots of kind of medium-sized earthquakes in an area. We don't know if it's going to be a precursor to a big one or if it's just kind of doing its thing. So all these earthquakes start happening in 2s and 3s, especially these 4s here in late March. People are like, hey, what's going on, and so this was the problem. And then the main shock occurred, and then the dots afterwards are aftershocks. So here I talked about the geometry of the earthquake. So we've seen that already. We already did the magnitude. By my calculations, 6.4. The instrumental measure is 6.3, but there's a little bit of difference there, but not a huge amount. Here is the intensity distribution. So don't be confused, because a lot of times we show dots. Sometimes they're earthquakes. This is what people felt. And so it was felt widely across Italy. The blues are kind of light. So remember Giuseppe Mercalli. The blues are 3s and 4s on the Mercalli intensity scale. So they're felt, but it's not a problem. You kind of go on with your day. The greens are starting to be worrisome. Buildings can start to have problems. And then you see very close, there's one orange 7. So that's when buildings start to collapse. So it was widely felt. And here, this is a key issue to look at in terms of the data. So this is time versus, on the right side is cumulative number of earthquakes. So that's the black line. So it's going up and up and up. And then the gray is the energy release. And so this just shows you that the little earthquakes, even though they're accumulating and we're seeing them go up and up and up, the bulk of the energy is in the one big earthquake, right? And so that's why the gray line just goes from here, just poof, and straight up. So this is key, because you'll see there's an incorrect statement in a few minutes that all the little earthquakes are actually releasing energy. They're not. They're just telling you something bad is going to happen, basically. So here, then, you guys read this, some of this? Yes? Okay, so this woman's really inspiring woman. She worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for 30 years in Southern California, was kind of a boss, did a lot of stuff. She's famous for sitting with her son, who was like 2 or 3 at the time, in the, I think, the Northridge earthquake in 1994, talking to the news, and she's trying to calm everybody and calm her son at the same time. It's kind of, she's sort of famous for that. But she finally, I think, had enough working for the USGS, and after 30 years, so she retired, and then she formed her Lucy Jones Center, where she tries to help people with hazard understanding, and she wrote this book, which is quite nice. So here's the thing for the L'Aquila, and just go back. Remember, this is all happening in basically this time. Okay, so try to remember the dates here. So we're sort of talking the second half of March into early April. So, but basically, so what happened was this guy, Giampaolo Giuliani, was a technician at the National Laboratory of Gran Sasso, which is a national facility, and he was interested in radon. And so radon's a certain kind, it's a natural gas that comes from the earth. And so the idea would be, if there was cracking, you might have a better way to pump the radon out. So the hypothesis would be that somehow increased radon might indicate some kind of increased cracking. This has never really been established scientifically for earthquakes, though, because if you have some small earthquakes, they're pretty deep. And so it's like we're making a connection all the way to the surface, except if we have like a magnitude 7 or 6.3. So these little guys aren't necessarily changing the plumbing that much. So it doesn't really work. But he was trying it, and he thought he was seeing an increase in radon. And there was this ongoing seismic activity. So in February 2009, he said he thought something was going to happen. He never wrote it down, and it was only the media that said, oh, well, Mr. Giuliani said something. So then on March 30th, he made another prediction of an imminent earthquake. He didn't really ever explain his methods except this radon. So this is part of the problem. But the problem was there was a void of information that was authoritative. So basically, everyone's like, well, what the heck's going on? The government's not saying anything. So they go to the next person who seems to be authoritative, who says, well, I think this could happen. So the Committee on Grand Risk is like, okay, we have to go. We have to tell people what's happening. So they go down and they convened. And they had to basically, the idea was, and this was the problem, is instead of explaining what was going on, their intention was to create this reassuring narrative, which in a way you can't blame them, but caused problems. So one person said, the civil protection person says, because there's an ongoing release of energy, the situation looks favorable. Now, this is false. We just showed you that all those tiny earthquakes aren't doing anything as far as releasing energy. So he said, yes, people should calm down and drink a glass of wine. Some residents made a choice to stay inside that evening. This is false because small earthquakes would imply bigger ones. This relationship I showed, lots of little ones, it's called the Gutenberg relationship. So therefore, and so then we transition to a little bit of the sort of after the fact. So there's a need for continual updating of authoritative information about future occurrence of potentially damaging earthquakes. Officially sanctioned dissemination of this information is needed. And here's the problem that everyone was working in. And so in a way, those guys were stuck in a very bad situation, is that this is called high gain, low probability. And let's just look at what that means. Is if you say, okay, there's one earthquake every 100 years, that's 100 times 365. So it's 1 in 36,500 would be the probability per day. So it's 10 to the minus 5. It was just a background rate. If you say, well, it's 100 times worse because there's a swarm going on, it's still 10 to the minus 3. It's still 1 in 1,000. So are you going to make a decision about your family, your life, at 10 to the minus 3? Maybe not, because actually you're still getting in your car. It's probably 10 to the minus 2. It's like 10 times worse. But that's what was going on. So the problem was these scientists were just in a no-win situation because this was what was going on. So the probability of a false alarm exceeded the failure to predict by quite a bit, even though the seismic activity had increased the probability of a large event by 100 times. Scientists were enticed into addressing a simple yes-no question: will be hit by a large earthquake? And the reassuring statements were widely interpreted to be an anti-alarm. And so that's that they were, in a sense, weak, right? They just were like, no, it's okay. They couldn't be like, guys, this is serious. We don't really know what's going on. But also the citizenry has a hard time tolerating probabilistic statements, right? Like, you guys all nod when I'm saying 10 to minus 10 to minus 3, but if you're, your average citizen who's not necessarily highly numerate, does that mean anything? Yeah. And they were still super unlucky because it's still 1 in 1,000 that it happened. And so the recommendations are: separate the role of scientific advisors, provide objective information about natural hazards from that of civil decision makers, weigh benefits of protective actions with costs of false alarms, other declarations. So the scientists have to say, here's what we know. The governor has to say, here's what we're going to do. And we use probabilistic statements rather than deterministic statements in characterizing these changes, like the meteorological community. So, it's 10% chance of rain, pretty much that means versus 80% chance. But you have to build intuition by experience. You have to just keep saying it. So suddenly people are like, okay, I guess that means I should act. So then this is 2015, so it took 6 years. But those people were, the scientists and the director of the Grand Risk Committee were arrested, basically, and charged with manslaughter. But they appealed, and so it went to Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation in Rome, following lengthy deliberations, but the court upheld the conviction of the public official. So this is the one who was enticing him. He got in trouble. So just a couple of things then. These are some new slides Kevin, you haven't seen, but I found them when I was preparing. So I found them right. This is actually, I went to Lockwood in 2018. Still could rebuild it. So look how many cranes, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is downtown, and you see the historic buildings being rebuilt. And then on the left is something, this is from Swiss RE. So this is important because maybe not all of you guys are going to be geoscientists, but you might be interested in economics. Reinsurance is a big industry because basically the insurers that insure insurance companies. And so it's very interesting for them, the reinsurance companies, to understand these phenomena. So they hire ecologists in these insurance companies because they're like, well, what's actually happening? But they also hire economists, building engineers. And so what this shows is on the left is the costliest earthquakes in Italy from 1968 to 2018, all in 2018 dollars. So the biggest, most expensive earthquake was actually 1980. The Irpinia earthquake was 36 billion. These are dollars. Yep. Emilia Romagna. So the one that messed up all the Parmesan cheese was an $18 billion earthquake. Friuli, 1976. Did you feel this earthquake? Oh, yeah. This one was a $15 billion earthquake, and actually a lot of people died in this. So luckily, that was only $4 billion in kind of direct economic losses. But the challenge for the government is, this is what Swiss RE is saying, and I thought you guys might find this interesting, is the efficacy of government spending is questionable. This level of spending in a mid-sized town in a scarcely populated area is inefficient. So they're not, softening the message here. Vulnerability and consequent extensive damage to the housing stock and the country's low insurance penetration, with society having become accustomed to relying on the government as the insurer of last resort. So it's fine, but basically the balance is this. Like Lockville has a famous place historically. It's in Abruzzo. So it's a famous mountain town of Abruzzo. And so the government's like, well, it's symbolically important, so we will pour $4 billion, or actually 18 billion into it to get it to go because it's symbolically important. But it's actually what the insurance company is saying is, well, aside from all the sentimental consideration, it's not really worth it. And so that's what you have to balance, right? Because it's all about the value of culture. And, the government's like, well, of course, we'll just do it. But, it's not cheap. It's real money. And so the direct cost here is 5 billion, but then the additional costs, including, and I'm not trying to say anything about Italy, but there was a lot of money skimmed off the top, so it was not super directly, efficiently put into the construction. So it's another 12 billion in additional costs to rebuild, and so anyway, question? I think the Belice Valley is one that we can show briefly for Italy, but other countries. So it's a little bit cultural. Like China, it's just like, well, we're done with that city. We're gonna do a new one over here, but anyway, let's look. Maybe I have time to do Belice, and we'll see what you guys think. But let me just. So then the last point from Swiss Re was starting in 2017. So basically, these disasters haven't happened that caused a change in laws. The government implemented fiscal measures to encourage retrofitting of vulnerable structures, basically by tax breaks, and also the uptake of natural catastrophe covers or insurance by private households and businesses. So they realize it's in a way cheaper to sort of invest in that front than to pay afterwards. So let's do Belice, and then I have some more big picture stuff. But let's just look at this because this sort of goes to your question. Okay, so this earthquake. So I'm just like some more earthquakes for lessons. But this earthquake occurred in Sicily in 1968, and it was not a huge event. But this is a really good website actually if you want to dig into data. So this is the intensity distribution for that earthquake. So you see it's in basically western Sicily, and maybe you can't really see the colors, but the redder is the more intense, and the red ones are 7s and 8s. So not magnitude, intensity. Roman numeral 7s and 8s. So lots of damage, and so you can see these buildings collapsed, and this infrastructure, 1968, these are a lot of unreinforced masonry, which doesn't do well with the kind of ground motions we would have in this near field for an earthquake like this. It knocks them down really easily. So the main problem here was a coordination of emergency management, lack of coordination. So 2 years after the earthquake, then Law number 996 outlines for the first time an overall framework of civil protection interventions, regulations on relief and assistance. So they basically formed the civil protection at that time. But the idea was to build entirely new towns. However, it was hard to convince people to move. So they just traditionally always lived in these places which were fully destroyed. So it's hard to get them to move. And so I think that's what this is showing on the right here is, I'm not sure this picture is either a place that was abandoned. I probably think it was one that was abandoned, but still, people are driving through there. So let me see, do I have more? Oh, this is just another view of that event. So I don't know, Keta, do you want to say a little bit more about Vanity Valley? Okay, so this earthquake, Messina, was famous because not only for the ground motion, but really for the tsunami. So this occurred down in this area between Sicily and Italy. 72,000 people died according to this record, but it's actually hard to measure because it's pretty early historically. Over 40% of the region of Messina, which is the Sicilian side, and 25% of Reggio di Calabria, which is the mainland side, were killed by the earthquake and tsunami. Some estimates are as high as 110,000 severe damage in this whole region, but the big thing was tsunamis. And I have some diagrams on that. So just some pictures of damage. You see the coast here. This is in Messina, so coastal town. The boardwalk is just completely blasted, and those who survived the earthquake faced the bleakest of realities. Their homes were destroyed, their family members were dead, and the cities around them reduced to rubble. The Italian government relocated many of the Messina survivors to new cities within Italy. Others were forced to emigrate to America. 1909, a cargo ship, the Florida, carried 850 passengers from Naples. They went to New York City. After 2 weeks on the Atlantic, the Florida's passengers endured a second disaster. The lost in dense fog, the Florida collided with the Republic. 3 people aboard the Florida were killed instantly. Within minutes, pandemonium broke out on the ship. The captain of the Florida, Angelo Ruspini, used extreme measures to gain control of the desperate passengers, including firing gunshots into the air. So I think it's just like you can imagine, sort of people are at their wits' end, and it's just like, ah. So here then is just to show a little bit of more detail on the earthquake. And so you can see these dots are the intensity distribution size by shaking that was felt. So it was super strong. So look at these numbers, 8 to 10. That's like the complete panic level. So it was felt really strongly in this area. But then here's a tsunami run up. So these are in meters. And so what you can see is the numbers there on that coast are like 4, 6.37, 8, 6. So half the height of this building is the height of the water going in. And so basically what happens is tsunami forms because and so here's what was thought was that the earthquake broke. And so here's just some pictures of the effects, like at the coast, just erosion and coastal damage. So anyway, that's that earthquake. Maybe we have time for one more. So this, because these two are important, I think, for immigration to the U.S. as kind of part of what drove some of Italian American immigration. So 1915, in the central Apennine, not far actually from Rome, just up the hill, this was earthquake is, what's the name? Fucino, and 20 and 30,000 people. So these early 20th century earthquakes were slightly larger than we see in the Apennine in the late 20th century, but also the construction was really traditional kind of unreinforced masonry, so they just really were devastating. Fortunately, in some of these ones we see in the late 20th century, people are dying, but the numbers are lower, possibly because of better construction. So here's the intensity distribution. So you can see where Rome is there on the lower left. So it was strongly felt in this region. And these are these towns that were just completely devastated. These percentages are numbers, like percent of the population that was killed. So it's all around this basin, which is a famous kind of agricultural area. And Avezzano, this is the one recollection from this one person who was young at the time. At 7:30, I was sent to my grandmother's along the Corso. At the time, there was no one. I came back home and I found Nicola and Gaetano sitting by the fireplace. The old earth started to shake with all of its mountains. With such force that the very hinge of the world seemed to fall down. From mysterious depths, a roar was rising, to which another roar replied from the frightened mountains. A heavy pressure caused by the wooden beam on the left side of my chest woke me up. Couldn't see how long I was buried, senseless, but as soon as I was awake, at once came back to my mind the furious, diabolic, deafening dance of my house, our screams, and my poor mother praying to Sant'Amidio. The formidable jumps of the opposite palace seen from the window, everything in a monstrous flashing moment. I felt great pain and shouted for help. So this was in the near field, big ground motions, and there's big mountains there, so probably some of what he was hearing was the groaning of the building, but also landslides from the mountains. And so here's what it looks like now. This is the Avezzano, where 80% of the people died in this town. But you can see it's a beautiful place, actually surrounded by faults. There's a fault right in here, but the fault that broke was in front.